Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Raise Asia. So today I'm going to examine the question, are Chinese people inherently cruel? So yesterday I watched a Nathan Rich video and he was basically giving a critique on a video made by this chubby white dude, forgotten his name, but it's inconsequential, he's a nobody. And this guy was basically giving his 2 cents of what he thought of Chinese people, Chinese culture in general. And once again, it's a critique that's laced with the usual trope of Chinese people being cruel to animals and the controlling nature of the Communist Party, etc. You know, the usual spiel that we constantly hear in the media. And so I wanted to examine this notion of Chinese people being exceptionally cruel. And it amazes me coming from especially white Western people. Like, it really is a bit rich, a bit hypocritical to call any other nationality cruel when over the 500 years of plunder and pillage that they've engaged in through imperialism and the daily enactment of being a colonial power in another person's land, subjecting them to a racial hierarchy, and then basically taking every resource for their own benefit. But within this time, subjecting them to physical perils so arduous that I think people of a less healthy stock would simply perish and not be able to even endure half of what, for example, African slaves have endured. And so I wanted to look at real accounts of what has indeed happened in these 500 years of white imperial Western rule and how they are in no position to ever accuse the Chinese of being more cruel than they themselves are. I agree that killing animals is cruel as a vegetarian. The simple fact it's not even just the act of eating the flesh of the animal, but it's the period of incarceration that infringes upon their natural ability just to experience existence, their existence as a valid sentient being, and I'm against that. But that being said, anybody who isn't vegetarian and who eats chicken, pigs, cows, basically they're in no position to criticize what the Chinese eat, because let's face it, it's the same barbaric practice of taking another life form and basically muting a big part of its natural existence in order for oneself to derive pleasure. So that moral sanctimonious stance of condemning one but believing themselves to be kinder is just 7 shades of hypocrisy, and that's what I abhor about the Anglo-West, especially the Anglo-West perspective on reality. So I want to start off today's journey with the most tame version by Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass was basically born in a slave plantation, and I don't even know how many generations in, but of course his ancestors were from the Atlantic slave trade. And so this particular episode of his autobiography, he's still working under Master Hugh, so he wasn't a free man as yet, but he was working at the gardener's shipyard, and he was very good at his work. And at that point, he became a challenge to the system, exactly what Japan was in the 80s, 90s, and exactly what China is now to the US. And basically, when Anglo-Western white people feel threatened, they revert back to the most primal instincts of using violence, stealing, and coercion, which is no different to what they're doing now. As we all know, America, Australia, and the UK especially, they're leading the brigade at the moment to sue China in their courts for negligence or whatever it is that they'd like to label. And America and Australia in particular, the politicians have expressly said they will take back China's assets or investments in the respective countries if China doesn't pony up for this accusation that they're trying to label China with. So, and it's not only contemporaneously that we can see this happening, it's happened throughout history. So yeah, so as I was talking about Frederick Douglass, he was accosted by 4 white guys, and it was a 4 against 1 fight. And even during this speed up, Douglass was able to withstand their assaults. And as he managed to stand up after being kicked down, one of the assailants actually kicked him in the eye, and he felt at that time as though his eyeball had burst out. So now I'm going to read from the book what he says. Dear reader, you can hardly believe this statement, but it is true, and therefore I write it down, that no fewer than 50 white men stood by and saw this brutal and shameful outrage committed, and not a man of them all interposed a single word of mercy. There were 4 against 1, and that one's face was beaten and battered most horribly, and no one said, that is enough, but some cried out, kill him, kill him, kill the damn nigger, knock his brains out, he struck a white person. I mention this inhuman outcry to show the character of the men and spirit of the times at Gardiner's shipyard, and indeed in Baltimore generally in 1836. So if you think about it, 1836 wasn't exactly that long ago. I mean, it's not in our lifetime, but, you know, that's the time in which I think most of us can say civility had already taken hold. Like, we were already fully clothed. We had textile industries, and we had homes with furniture. So this wasn't out in the boonies where people are like rubbing sticks together. Now, the second story that I'd like to read from is from the life of Olaudah Equiano, and he was basically a slave too. And now he's talking about the laws on the island of St. Kitts. This is quite an eye-opener, and it shows the sadism that was prevalent at the time, especially amongst white people, in how they treated black people. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to read from this particular section. First of all, in order to instill a sense of fear in the slaves, and this was actually a common practice, one of the white masters would actually randomly choose one particular slave and make an example of him. Usually it was male. So a common practice is to first cut somebody, and this particular story involved cutting a man into about 300 odd pieces and forcing the other slaves to each consume one section. And if they refused to, then they themselves would be threatened with the same level of punishment. So basically it forced cannibalism on a whole group of people. And another common practice was that the slaves were to be branded with the initial letters of the master's name. Okay, and I'm going to read from the book. And a load of heavy iron hooks hung about their necks. Indeed, on the most trivial occasions, they were loaded with chains, and often instruments of torture were added. The iron muzzle, thumb screws are so well known as not to need a description. And they were sometimes applied for the slightest faults. I have seen a Negro beaten till some of his bones were broken for only letting a pot boil over. It is not uncommon after a flogging to make slaves go on their knees and thank their owners and pray, or rather say, God bless you. I have often asked many of the men slaves, who used to go several miles to their wives and late in the night after having been wearied with a hard day's labor, why they went so far for wives and did not take them of their own master's Negro women, and particularly those who lived together as household slaves. Their answers have ever been, because when the master or mistress choose to punish the women, they make the husbands flog their own wives, and that we could not bear to do. So, I don't know if anybody feels what I feel when I read that. The level of depravity that must be inherent in the souls of these people, it is so heinous that sometimes I'm at a loss in how to describe human nature. How can you subject somebody to that level of physical pain and emotional torture is unfathomable. And I'll read another little episode of what they used to do too. So during the fragments of downtime in a slave's life, some of the female slaves would collect grass, and I assume, like, I don't believe it's weed, but they did collect grass, and I suppose it was a valuable commodity at the time. And then they would go to kind of small street stores to try to sell them. Okay, now I'm going to read from the from the story. Okay, so, yep, this they commonly tie up in a parcel, either a bit's worth, 6pence, or half a bit's worth, and bring it to town or the markets to sell. Nothing is more common than for the white people on this occasion to take the grass from them without paying for it. And not only so, but too often also, to my knowledge, our clerks and many others at the same time have committed acts of violence on the poor, wretched and helpless females, whom I have seen for hours stand crying to no purpose and get no redress or pay of any kind. So, if you can understand what this means, it's literally stealing from the poor. And it's not even from the poor, it's the most wretched. It's even worse than taking from a child, because a child in modern day society has basic human rights. These people were treated worse than animals, and any semblance of happiness or value that they could inject into their self-esteem, basically a life of drudgery, it was taken away from them. Even something so minute was taken away from them. And that's how white people rule. That's the level of cruelty that they are capable of exacting, in which they claim other people are cruel in how they treat animals. And they're treating humans like that. Not that humans are particularly better than animals, but if we argue scientifically that pain is equated with intelligence, it says something. Okay, and now this book is from the Black Jacobin. So this is about the Haitian Revolution, and this is possibly the most harrowing because it's very graphic. This is one book that you can't put down. Okay, so I'm going to read, I'm going to read from the book now. But there was no ingenuity that fear or depraved imagination could devise which was not employed to break their spirit and satisfy the lusts and resentment of their owners and guardians. Irons on the hands and feet, blocks of wood that the slaves had to drag behind them wherever they went, the tin plate mask designed to prevent the slaves eating the sugarcane, the iron collar. Whipping was interrupted in order to pass a piece of hot wood on the buttocks of the victim. Salt, pepper, citron, cinders, aloes, and hot ashes were poured on the bleeding wounds. Mutilations were common, limbs, ears, and sometimes the private parts, to deprive them of the pleasures which they could indulge in without expense. Their masters poured burning wax on their arms and heads and shoulders, emptied the boiling cane sugar over their heads, burned them alive, roasted them on slow fires, filled them with gunpowder and blew them up with a match, buried them up to their neck and smeared their heads with sugar that the flies might devour them, fastened them near to nests of ants or wasps, then made them eat their excrement, drink their urine, lick the saliva of other slaves. One colonist was known in moments of anger to throw himself on his slaves and stick his teeth into their flesh. Okay. So, yeah, I don't want to read it anymore because it's pretty graphic, this book. So you can see that the way that white people have treated black people were without consideration of not even them being human, but even as a living being, they didn't offer that level of consideration. And while they did not treat Asians in the same callous manner with the same level of brutality, they did subject them to the same level of disrespect and disregard for Asian people as, once again, living beings with their own rights to pursue their own liberty and happiness. So the Opium War, of course, is something that we are all well versed in, but I don't know if people are familiar with the nitty-gritty in how much thought went behind this and the conclusion. And this was a very lucid conclusion. So like I keep on saying, this is not due to the fact that they did not know about these things. Like, for example, during Frederick Douglass's time, trains already had first class carriages and second class, etc., right? But dogs and monkeys were permitted to travel on first class. So they were well aware of the scientific demarcations of what different things were. So this isn't, for example, during the times in which human sacrifices were made and people weren't scientifically aware of differences. Okay, so during the opium smuggling time, there were British people who were basically pro-opium and others that were against. And basically, this is the argument that was spurned during those times. They argued that Chinese people were constitutionally different. They had a different disposition, and that their bodies could withstand the ravages of opium better than what white British people could. So while it was definitely unscrupulous, cruel, barbaric, and unfathomable to subject a white infant to a narcotic such as opium, but it was okay to cause an addiction in a Chinese baby because apparently they were less affected by opium. And of course, this was ardently untrue, yet for some reason, that's what they argued, even though it went against all. They had no proof of this. They just conjectured that this was so through their observations, okay? But the person who wrote Drugging a Nation, which is a book that I'm reading from, is Samuel Merwin, and he was basically a British journalist who went to research the Opium Wars, and basically he dug up government documents, and because he really wanted to know exactly what went on. And one of the a very big study that was undertaken called the Philippine Opium Commission report basically was a survey that was conducted using a few countries and asking for their opinions on what they thought of the opium trade. And so they asked Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and the US. And of course, all the countries were adamantly against it because they already knew the perils of opium addiction. So none of them agreed that opium should be smuggled into China. And at that time, America, for a sliver of its life, exercised some semblance of sanity and humanity along with a good conscience. And let's see here. Okay. No American. Okay. It is not perhaps generally known that in the only instance where America has made official utterances relative to the use of opium in the East, she has spoken with no uncertain voice. By treaty with China in 1880 and again in 1903, no American bottoms are allowed to carry opium in Chinese waters. This is due to a recognition that the use of opium is an evil for which no financial gain can compensate and which America will not allow her citizens to encourage, even passively. Thus, the United States is flatly on record as forbidding her citizens to engage in any way whatever in the Chinese opium traffic. So during that time, America actually had a conscience and refused to be involved. But then its ugly twin, Britain, had no compunction in drugging an entire nation. So this is the level of morality. And the West has always taken in turn, like, it's good cop, bad cop throughout the way. Now when America is the leader in being destructive and leading our realm of dystopia, Britain sometimes takes a back seat. But back when Britain was uno in its imperial reign, Britain was the biggest ass in the world. So when I listen to especially Anglo-white Western people critique the Chinese and China, it's just, it makes me guffaw. And it's sick, because even if you can't afford to buy a mirror, I'm sure you can take a look at your mug on, you know, like a puddle or somewhere. That's my 2 cents. Okay, thank you everybody for listening, and keep fighting the good fight. Never back down, never. This is something that we need to do. We need to raise our voices, and we need to be heard. And like I always said, it's not about changing opinions, it's about learning to fight. And that's the most important thing that we need to do. So stay healthy, and see you next time. Thank you.